So the Russian military has now begun abandoning their frontline positions in Ukraine. And I know it sounds dramatic, but it's true. Although in this case, we're not talking about infantry units quite yet, or drone operators, but rather air defense systems, which are now being reallocated away from the front lines towards locations that Russia deems to be more strategic, which is code for more important to protecting our leadership who cares about our soldiers. But while that might be where Russia is starting, in this war in particular, and really in all wars, removing your air defense systems is step one of a process that becomes almost inevitable, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this video, where once the air defense systems are removed, it creates a catalyzing series of events that will eventually likely result in Russian forces actually physically leaving their positions. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's first talk about where these air defense systems are actually going. And they're really going to three major locations, according to President Zelensky of Ukraine, who has proven to be reliable when he gives announcements like this. Often his statements are treated as unreliable or propaganda, or we have to take them with a grain of salt. But if we actually test his statements over time, they almost always turn out to be 100% accurate, because he wants to be deemed a reliable resource. So that in mind, President Zelensky is telling us that Russian air defenses are going to three major places. Moscow, which isn't so surprising, the Kerch Strait Bridge, which also isn't so surprising, and the third location is, you probably think I'm about to say St. Petersburg, but that's not actually it. It's actually Valdai, or Valdai, I don't know exactly how to say it, it's in Russian. Now this location is a location that a lot of people won't have heard of. And you might wonder why this location is being prioritized over St. Petersburg, Russia's second biggest metropolitan area. And the answer is simple. This is the location where the Russian elites have all of their vacation homes. And it really seems that the Russian elites are trying to navigate air defense systems so that they are still protected if they have to leave their precious home capital city of Moscow, either due to Ukrainian pressure or internal pressure, or both, or just because they want to take a nice little summer vacation, even if it results in the death of thousands of their soldiers on the front line. Folks, you just cannot make this stuff up. Now, while these trends are incredibly significant, more significant than many people realize, they're actually not all that surprising, and that's what makes it even more exciting. Because what Russia is doing right now is actually incredibly predictable. They are being forced into dilemmas, and in response to those dilemmas, they are making choices that anybody who understands the psychology of a dictator could predict. Ukraine then is forcing Russia into a trap. It is a long-term trap, one that they've actually been forcing Russia into since the beginning of this war. But that trap is now closing tighter and tighter and tighter. And it's reaching the point where soon it will spring shut. And Russia won't be able to get out of that trap and push much further at all. There is a lot to talk about in today's video that will dictate the strategy of this war from this point going forward. So let's get into it right after today's sponsor. Today's sponsor is perfect for discussions like the one we're having right now, where the news is so dramatic that it's actually hard to know who to believe. And that sponsor is Ground News, who makes it easier to read through media bias and get to the truth of the underlying narrative and the underlying facts. What Ground News does is they bring together articles from across the political spectrum for any given topic, all in one place. But they do a whole lot more than that too. For each given article, or source of an article, they identify whether that source has a known political bias, how factual they're known to be, and also who funds the source, which can sometimes tell you the reason for a potential bias. One thing I really like in Ground News is the bias summary at the top of every subject, which basically reads the articles for you and identifies the competing narratives, if there are any, before you even dive in. I find Ground News super helpful because in today's media environment, every news story is made into a divisive issue, even if it doesn't have to be. Now, sometimes that's valid, and that's important to discover too. Ground News ensures that we see the proper division where it's needed, while avoiding division if people are maybe just trying to be dramatic. If you want to check out Ground News for yourself right now before you forget, you can actually get a 40% discount off their Vantage plan by subscribing through my link at ground.news/Paul. or by using the QR code on screen. And that Vantage plan is the same plan that I personally use to get access to all of their best features. So check them out now, and thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. So getting back into it, let's discuss why at this exact moment Russia is choosing to relocate so many air defense systems. And therein lies the real beauty. Because it turns out Russia is not actually choosing to do this. That choice is being made for them by Ukraine. And Russia is just responding appropriately to the incentives that Ukraine has created. This is obviously in response to Ukraine's recent campaigns, where Ukraine has really ramped up the strikes on Russian logistics. But they've also ramped up their strikes on the city of Moscow, and they've also ramped up their strikes on the peninsula of Crimea, hitting many targets, in particular around the Kerch Strait Bridge. This is creating so many different problems for Russia that we've discussed at length in my recent videos. We've talked about how Crimea is now having fuel shortages because trucks just can't get through. We've also talked about how the Moscow refinery is now offline, potentially experts are saying until at least 2027, which is a very long time since peak fuel demand in Russia is right now exactly at this moment in this season. Ukraine has really been ramping up the pressure on Russia, forcing Russia to make decisions that they might not otherwise want to make, forcing Russia to make choices about what they actually value and what they actually want to prioritize. And Vladimir Putin in particular here has a specific choice. Do I want to weaken my frontline soldiers, or do I want to weaken my perception in the minds of my own people? And that is an easy choice. Ukraine very clearly understands, after several years of fighting this war against Russia, exactly how Russian leadership behaves and exactly what Russia prioritizes. And it now seems that Ukraine has flipped a switch to take advantage of that. Ukraine is no longer just collecting data about how Russia responds. Ukraine is no longer just grinding Russia down over time. At least for the current moment, Ukraine is actively trying to create conditions on the battlefield that are favorable to them in near real time, or at least at timescales that for this war are rather unfathomable. For most of this war, things have moved at a snail's pace if they have moved at all. But over the past month or so, we have just seen a dramatic escalation with a lot of strategic outcomes being achieved basically in the blink of an eye. And Ukraine probably knew exactly how Russia would behave in response to these recent strikes, and they knew exactly that Russia would abandon the front line with their air defense systems because of what they've observed throughout the war. First and foremost, they've observed that Russia already has been moving air defense systems from the front lines towards Moscow, albeit at a smaller scale. Every time Ukraine destroys an air defense system, Russia has the decision. Do we replace that air defense system by taking one from a different area, or do we let that area stay open? And every time Russia does this, they reveal something. They give Ukraine intelligence. And it's intelligence about what they actually value and what they will therefore invest more resources in defending if they have to make tough choices later on. Crimea is a perfect example. Crimea has been a peninsula throughout the war where Ukraine has been destroying air defense systems just left and right in big phases. They'll go in and they'll destroy air defense systems, and then they'll give Russia some breathing space. And in that breathing space, Russia will come in and they'll replace all of those air defense systems, and then Ukraine will just come in and destroy them all again. It's happened so many times, I have actually lost count. And Russia, in doing this, revealed something very important. Their propaganda strategy is more important to them than their military strategy. They would rather move air defense systems from other areas they're needed to Crimea to give an aura of safety to the Russian people, even if that means that their overall war strategy is diminishing over time. Now, Russia probably did this thinking that they would outlast Ukraine eventually, seeing attrition of their air defenses as a mere inconvenience. But it's now reached the point where Russia is so low on air defenses that they actually have to create some very real holes that Ukraine can exploit. That's where we are today. And it's a narrative about what's going on in Moscow and what's going on in Crimea that a lot of people are missing. Where these could be the objectives in and of themselves, and Ukraine is doing a great job in these places, But it could also be that these strikes that Ukraine is doing right now are to create the conditions that they can exploit on the front lines. Russia has to make a choice either way. None of these things are good for them, but again, their decision was rather predictable. Right now, as Ukraine is being incredibly successful in striking Crimea and in striking Moscow, a lot of people think that this is Ukraine's primary military objective, and perhaps it is, but it also could be something else. It could be that Ukraine is creating the leverage for themselves to eventually actually attack the front lines by diverting resources away from the front lines rather than by hitting them directly. In other words, Ukraine is targeting Russia in their soft underbelly so that the rest of their body is a little bit more exposed when they go to protect themselves. Now, it could be that this is Ukraine's actual primary strategy. Hit Crimea so that Russia moves resources from the front lines and then attack the front lines. Or it could be just that Ukraine has created several good options for themselves no matter what Russia does. If Russia doesn't protect Crimea, if Russia doesn't protect Moscow, that's obviously going to be really, really bad for them in and of itself, and Ukraine still wins. But if Russia more predictably does move to protect these things, it actually unlocks the war strategy that Ukraine has needed to actually take its territory back. That said, whether Ukraine masterfully planned it this way or whether it just happened this way, it doesn't really matter, because the result is still the same, and it is definitely happening this way. Air defenses are being pulled away from the front lines, and that is going to dramatically change the nature of the front line itself in a way that could ultimately be decisive for how the war is ended. It's actually hard to overstate the significance here. Maybe right now it's just that it's only limited to a couple of areas, but as the air defense shortage grows, so will the significance. And it actually changes one of the underlying facts about how this entire war has been fought. A lot of people know that the war in Ukraine has been defined by the fact that neither side has ever gotten air superiority over the other. Each side has been rather capable of defending their own territory with their air defense systems, to the point that neither side has been willing to, for example, risk their limited fighter jets or their limited military aircraft of any kind to attack the other. Russia has taken advantage of this to introduce a defining strategy for this war, the Russian glide bomb, a bomb that they have used to devastate Ukrainian cities, to level the cities, and eventually, over enough time, force Ukrainians out of their positions. It's actually one of the few tools that Russia has actually used to make consistent progress, albeit very slow. And the only reason it works is because Russian aircraft fly behind the Russian air defense shield and fire these glide bombs that then go in where the air defense networks are, and they destroy Ukrainian targets without the aircraft ever being at risk of getting destroyed itself. The reason it works that way is because these glide bombs are fired from a range where Ukrainian fighters will not go. Because if the Ukrainian fighters enter that range, they'll be struck by Russian air defense systems. And so when Russia moves their air defense, it doesn't just affect their defensive strategy, it affects their offensive strategy. And Russia's entire offensive strategy is dependent really on them being able to push different areas of the front line whenever there are spots of weakness. By removing air defense systems, it's not only areas that are going to be opened up where Ukraine can attack those areas more easily, it's also less areas that Ukraine has to think about defending because Russian aircraft cannot be as effective there. Again, it changes the entire dynamic of the war, and it's also happening at a time that is incredibly significant. Because recently, Ukraine, for example, has started to introduce glide bombs of their own. And these glide bombs will only be more and more effective if Russian air defenses have more gaps in them. That's a big deal in and of itself. But Ukraine also recently announced that they're going to be bringing Swedish Gripen fighter jets into their arsenal. And so if these Gripens are arriving near the front lines at the exact moment that Russian frontline air defense is at its weakest point ever, it gives Ukraine all sorts of new opportunities that they've never had to actually puncture the Russian front lines. Now, that being said, it gets even worse than this for Russia the more that their air defense systems are moved, especially to places like Moscow. Because the more that these air defense systems are moved, the more there are vulnerabilities, not just along the front, but also in the rear, which is just as, if not more important. Right now, we see exactly what happens when there is an air defense shortage in the rear, which is Ukraine's logistics lockdown, where they are preventing supplies from ever reaching the front lines in the first place. Right now, we actually have testimonies from Ukrainian drone pilots saying that in occupied Ukrainian territory, they're basically operating uncontested. There is no Russian air defense to actually shoot down their drones. And they are using that to actually unleash this hell on the Russians that's causing this situation in Crimea in the first place. That's actually part of the reason why Russia is moving their air defense systems. It's a big dilemma. But because this also creates shortages, not just in Crimea, but on the front lines, it changes the dynamic of the front lines in a way that is not favorable for Russia at this exact time when these front lines are going to be more open to assaults than they ever have been before. This is a recipe for disaster for the Russians, where they might actually flee their positions. You have to think about the calculus here if you're a Russian soldier. You're undersupplied and under-equipped on a good day, and very likely to lose your life on an assault no matter what. But now on top of that calculus, you remove the one thing that you thought you could count on, which was security, at least when you were at your own positions. Security that was provided by your air defense systems. You remove those systems from the equation, and now all of a sudden, you're not only likely to get eliminated when you go to attack the enemy, but you also feel vulnerable in your position itself. And while you're sitting in this position, because there's no air defense, you're not getting food, you're not getting water, you're not getting ammunition. What is your incentive to actually stay in your position? Pretty much all of your incentive is gone, and it's now actually a rather easy choice for more people than ever before to pick up and leave their positions. Once that starts happening, more people will catch on, and it will grow and grow and grow and grow. You add on to this the ability for Ukraine to send ground robotics in with actual air support, and it's just a nightmare for the Russians. And you could easily see a scenario where they're actually forced to flee their positions even without an all-out Ukrainian assault, an all-out Ukrainian offensive. But even if Ukraine requires an offensive, because they would have air support that the Russians have not traditionally had when they're on the offensives, Ukraine would actually be far more effective than the Russians have ever been. The tide here is really turning. Now, will Russia just allow that to happen, or will they respond to it? That's hard to say. But it doesn't really matter, because we see here that Russia is now trapped. Ukraine has Russia in a position where they are now responding to whatever Ukraine does. They're kind of panicking. Ukraine strikes Moscow and Crimea, so they have to move their air defense systems. Maybe they successfully start protecting these cities, but that's at the expense of the front lines. And so Ukraine then takes advantage of those vulnerabilities to attack the front lines like ever before until they reach a wall. The Russians start panicking about that, and so they start allocating more systems to the front line again. But that leaves vulnerabilities at the areas that they just moved those air defense systems to protect. And so Ukraine hits those again, and the cycle goes back and forth and back and forth. Unless Russia realizes exactly what's happening, and they decide to sit down and actually negotiate a surrender. This is the situation that Russia is now trapped in. There's not a lot of good responses to this situation because Ukraine has the momentum. They are dictating where the battles are fought and how they're fought, and it is brilliant. Ukraine has been working for years to create these conditions, and now Ukraine is exploiting them, and there's no telling what could happen next, but it certainly will not be good for Russia. Perhaps the worst part of this, though, for Russia is that even moving all of their air defense systems to Moscow and Crimea might not actually make a difference there, though it will make the front much more vulnerable. We already see that Russia has a lot of air defense around Moscow, layers and layers of it. And already, Ukraine is getting through, and they're hitting incredibly strategic targets, like the Moscow refinery. And the biggest irony of that is that there was this iconic image from this Ukrainian strike, where a Russian oil tank blew its lid high into the sky. And this was an explosion that was not caused by a Ukrainian drone or even a Ukrainian cruise missile. Rather, it was caused by a Russian air defense missile, which missed its target and hit Russia's own assets. Maybe by moving their air defense systems, Russia is just putting their capital in even more danger, not from the Ukrainians, but from themselves. And there's absolutely nothing about this war that's more poetic than that. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please do be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Not because it helps me, but because if you enjoy this content, it ensures that you see more of it, not just from me, but from other YouTubers like me. With that being said, thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. I will see you on the next one.